The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, cream-colored and slightly worn at the edges, bearing the unmistakable stamp of the State Correctional Facility. Elena Torres held it between her fingers, feeling the weight of words not yet read, words written by a stranger behind bars who called himself Daniel Morrison. She had been volunteering with the Prison Pen Pal initiative for 3 months now, responding to inmates who sought connection with the outside world. But this was the first letter that made her pause before opening it. There was something in the careful way her name had been written across the front, each letter precisely formed, that suggested the hand behind it belonged to someone who chose his words as carefully as a jeweler selects stones. Elena settled into the window seat of her small apartment in Brooklyn, the autumn light filtering through the glass and casting amber shadows across the page as she slid her finger beneath the seal. The handwriting inside matched the envelope, elegant and controlled, almost old-fashioned in its formality. Daniel Morrison introduced himself as a man of 35 years, imprisoned for financial crimes he insisted were the result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, working for the wrong people. He had been an accountant, he claimed, for a legitimate investment firm that turned out to be laundering money for interests he had been kept deliberately ignorant of. When the federal investigation came down like a hammer, he had been swept up with the truly guilty, unable to afford the kind of lawyers who could have separated fact from association. What struck Elena most was not his claim of innocence, which she had read in various forms from other correspondents, but rather the questions he asked her. He wanted to know what book she was reading, what she thought about when she couldn't sleep, whether she believed people were fundamentally good or fundamentally broken. He wrote about philosophy and poetry, quoting Rilke and Neruda from memory, and he confessed that the worst part of prison was not the loss of freedom, but the loss of beauty. The inability to stand in a museum before a painting and lose himself in color and form. Elena found herself writing back that very evening, longer than she had written to anyone else in the program. She told him about her dreams of opening an independent bookstore, a small sanctuary filled with stories and the smell of old pages, a place where people could find themselves in the narratives of others. She wrote about her sister Sophia, 23 and brilliant, working her way through law school with a fire in her belly for justice that sometimes worried Elena with its intensity. She mentioned, almost casually, that their father had left when Elena was 23 and Sophia was 18, her disappearing without explanation, leaving behind only questions and a hollow space at the dinner table that had never been filled. The letters became a rhythm, arriving every week like clockwork. Daniel, she learned, had been educated at Columbia before his life took its unfortunate turn. He had grown up in New York, though he remained vague about which neighborhood, and he spoke about the city with the kind of intimate knowledge that comes from truly living in a place rather than simply existing there. He recommended restaurants Elena had never heard of, tucked away jazz clubs and poetry readings in basement venues that he promised still existed if she looked hard enough. His taste was impeccable, slightly expensive, the kind of recommendations that made Elena wonder what kind of accountant he had been to know these places. What Elena did not know, he could not know as she sealed each letter and sent it into the system, was that Daniel Morrison was a fiction as carefully constructed as any novel. The man reading her words in a private cell afforded luxuries that other inmates could only dream of through a combination of bribery and fear was Dante Moretti, heir to one of New York's oldest and most dangerous crime families. At 35, Dante had spent 3 years in prison not because justice had caught up with him, but because he had allowed himself to be caught, taking the fall for crimes that would have sent his aging father to prison for life. It had been a strategic sacrifice, a way to consolidate power and eliminate rivals who thought the Moretti family was weakened by their boss's imprisonment. From his cell, Dante ran an empire. Messages were passed through corrupted guards, through lawyers who served 2 masters, through visitors who looked like family members but were actually lieutenants reporting on territory disputes and revenue streams. The prison sentence was an inconvenience, nothing more, and Dante had turned it into an opportunity to build alliances with inmates from other organizations, creating a network that stretched from New York to Miami, from Chicago to Los Angeles. He was not rehabilitating, he was expanding. The Pen Pal program had been Marco Santini's idea. Marco, Dante's oldest friend and most trusted second-in-command had been running operations on the outside with brutal efficiency, but he had come to Dante 6 months ago with a problem that required a delicate touch. Roberto Torres, a federal prosecutor who had testified against the Moretti family 5 years earlier, had disappeared into witness protection after the trial. The testimony had been devastating, putting away 3 of Dante's uncles and 2 cousins, dismantling significant portions of the family's operations. Dante had ordered a hit in retaliation, a message that betrayal carried consequences even from those who hid behind badges in courtrooms. The hit had failed. Roberto Torres had been shot twice outside his home in Queens, but he had survived, rushed to the hospital, and then spirited away by federal marshals into the witness protection program before Dante's people could finish the job. For 5 years, Roberto Torres had been a ghost, relocated somewhere in America under a new name, a new identity, unreachable and untouchable. But Marco's sources had recently learned that Torres was preparing to emerge from hiding, ready to testify again in a new case that threatened to bring down not just the Morettis, but 4 other families as well. The problem was simple. They could not find him. Every lead had gone cold. Every informant had come up empty. But Marco had discovered something interesting in his research. Roberto Torres had left behind 2 daughters when he disappeared, Elena and Sofia Torres, who had been abandoned without explanation or financial support beyond what their father's pension provided. The daughters had no idea where their father was, had not heard from him in 5 years, but Marco theorized that eventually Torres would make contact. Men like him, men with consciences, eventually cracked under the weight of their guilt. When Torres reached out to his daughters, the Morettis would be watching. Dante had agreed to the plan with cold calculation. The prison pen pal initiative gave him access to Elena Torres under a false identity, a way to gather intelligence while establishing a connection that could be exploited. He had expected to find the daughter of a prosecutor to be rigid, judgmental, perhaps even suspicious. Instead, he found Elena's letters to be filled with warmth and optimism, a belief in redemption that seemed almost naive given what the world had shown her. She worked at a community library during the day and volunteered at a literacy center 3 evenings a week, teaching immigrants to read English. She saved every penny toward her bookstore dream, living frugally in a way that made Dante, who had never worried about money in his life, feel a strange twinge of something he did not immediately recognize as guilt. 6 months into their correspondence, Dante's lawyers found the technicality they had been paid extravagantly to find: a procedural error in his arrest, evidence collected without proper warrant, testimony from a witness who had been coerced by overzealous federal agents. It was enough to reduce his sentence, to secure an early release that would surprise no one who understood how justice worked for people with resources. Dante Moretti walked out of prison on a cold November morning, his conviction overturned on appeal, a free man in the eyes of the law, if not in the eyes of those who knew what he truly was. Marco picked him up in a black Mercedes, the kind of understated luxury that screamed money without being ostentatious. They drove through the city as Marco briefed him on everything that had happened in his absence, the territories that had been secured, the rivals who had been eliminated, the politicians and judges who had been bought. Dante listened with half his attention, Mama and the other half occupied with thoughts of Elena Torres and whether he would actually go through with the plan to meet her. He told himself it was still about the mission, about finding Roberto Torres, but the truth was more complicated than he wanted to admit. He had been writing to Elena for months, and somewhere in the exchange of words and ideas, something had shifted. Her letters had become the thing he looked forward to most, more than reports from Marco, more than news of successful operations. She made him remember who he had been before the family business consumed him, back when he had actually attended Columbia as Daniel Morrison claimed to have done, back when he had believed he might choose a different path. Elena wrote about books and beauty and second chances with a conviction that made Dante wonder if redemption was actually possible, or if it was just another pretty lie people told themselves to sleep better at night. The coffee shop where they agreed to meet was in the West Village, a small place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, the kind of authentic spot that had somehow survived the neighborhood's relentless gentrification. Dante arrived early, choosing a table in the back corner where he could see the door, a habit ingrained by years of needing to know who was entering any room he occupied. He wore a simple navy sweater and jeans, looking more like a professor than a criminal. His dark hair slightly longer than he had worn it before prison, his face clean-shaven to remove any hint of the hardness that prison had etched into him. Elena arrived exactly on time, and Dante felt his breath catch in a way that annoyed him with its adolescent intensity. She was prettier than the single photograph she had sent him, her dark hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, her eyes warm and intelligent behind simple glasses. She wore a green dress under a worn leather jacket, and she carried a canvas bag overflowing with books, presumably from the library where she worked. When she saw him, she smiled with genuine warmth, and Dante stood, extending his hand before realizing the gesture was too formal and pulling her into a brief hug instead. They talked for 3 hours, the conversation flowing as easily as it had in their letters, perhaps even more so with the addition of laughter and facial expressions, the small intimacies of physical presence. Elena told him about Sophia's progress in law school, about the bookstore space she had been scouting in the neighborhood, about her work teaching Mrs. Chen from Guangzhou to read English well enough to help her grandson with his homework. Dante found himself telling her truths mixed with lies, talking about his time in prison with calculated vulnerability, describing it as a dark period he was grateful to have behind him, a chance to pay for mistakes and emerge ready to build something better. When he asked about her father, Elena's face clouded with pain that she tried unsuccessfully to hide. She told him the story she had mentioned in letters, but with more detail now, more emotion. Her father had been a prosecutor, dedicated to his work in a way that had made him absent even when he was physically present. Then one day, 5 years ago, he had simply disappeared. No note, no phone call, just gone. The marshals had come to their apartment eventually, tight-lipped and official, informing Elena and Sophia that their father had entered witness protection and could not contact them for their own safety. There had been money at first, a pension that helped, but emotionally they had been orphaned, left to wonder what they had done wrong, why they had not been worth staying for. Dante listened to this story that he already knew, but hearing it in Elena's voice, seeing the hurt that still lived in her eyes, made it real in a way that Marco's intelligence reports had not. This woman across from him, drinking her 3rd cup of coffee and absently tearing her napkin into strips, had been collateral damage in a war she did not even know was being fought. Her father had testified against the Morettis to save his own life, and Dante had ordered him killed in retaliation. And now here sat Elena, talking to the man responsible for her abandonment without knowing she was confiding in her enemy. He should have felt nothing. Dante had ordered worse things than a failed hit on a prosecutor. He had authorized violence against people who were innocent of anything except being related to his enemies. He had built his empire on fear and blood, and he had slept perfectly well doing it because it was the life he had been born into, the only life he had ever known how to live. But sitting across from Elena Torres in a coffee shop in the West Village, watching her smile return as she changed the subject to something lighter, Dante felt the unfamiliar weight of something that might have been shame. They made plans to see each other again, dinner the following week, a gallery opening that Elena had been excited about, and then maybe a poetry reading at the bookstore where she dreamed of working one day. Dante agreed to all of it, telling himself he was simply maintaining the cover, building trust that would eventually lead him to Roberto Torres. But as he watched Elena leave the coffee shop, on her canvas bag bouncing against her hip as she waved goodbye, he knew he was lying to himself as thoroughly as he was lying to her. Marco was waiting in the Mercedes down the block, and his expression when Dante climbed into the passenger seat was somewhere between knowing and concerned. They had been friends since childhood, growing up together in the same neighborhood, when attending the same schools before their paths had diverged and then converged again, when Marco had chosen loyalty to Dante over everything else, including his own safety. Marco could read Dante better than anyone, which made him both invaluable and occasionally inconvenient. "You like her," Marco said. Not a question but a statement of fact as he pulled into traffic. "This is going to be a problem, Dante. You understand that, right? She's the daughter of the man who almost destroyed your family. When Roberto Torres comes out of hiding, and he will come out eventually, you're going to have to make a choice. The family or this girl you barely know. Dante stared out the window at the city passing by, the streets he had known his entire life suddenly feeling foreign and complicated. "I can keep it separate," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Business is business. Whatever I feel or don't feel for Elena doesn't change what needs to happen when we find her father." Marco did not argue, but his silence spoke volumes. They both knew that feelings, once acknowledged, could not simply be compartmentalized and controlled like business operations or strategic decisions. Dante Moretti, who had built his reputation on being cold and calculating, who had made impossible choices without hesitation when the family required it, was walking into a situation that could destroy everything he had built, and he was doing it with his eyes open, unable or unwilling to stop himself. Over the following weeks, Dante courted Elena with the kind of focused intensity that he usually reserved for business acquisitions. He took her to the gallery opening where they stood before abstract paintings and debated the meaning of color and form. Elena's passion for art making her eyes shine in a way that made Dante want to buy her every painting in the room. He accompanied her to the poetry reading, sitting in a cramped bookstore while local poets shared their work, and afterward, he recited Neruda from memory in the original Spanish, translating for her in a low voice that made her blush. They walked through Central Park on Sunday mornings, Dante pointing out architectural details of buildings that bordered the park, sharing stories about the city's history that he had learned growing up, carefully editing out the parts where that history intersected with his family's criminal activities. They had dinner in small restaurants in neighborhoods tourists never found, places where Dante was greeted with respect that Elena attributed to his charm and generous tipping rather than the fear and obligation that actually motivated it. With each date, each shared conversation and moment of laughter, Dante fell deeper into something he had never expected to feel. Elena challenged him intellectually, matching his knowledge of literature and art with her own passionate interpretations. She made him laugh with her observations about people they passed on the street, spinning elaborate stories about their lives that were probably more interesting than reality. She listened when he talked about his own past, the edited version he could share, and she offered understanding without judgment, her belief in second chances extending to him in a way that made Dante feel simultaneously grateful and guilty. Sophia, however, was not convinced. When Elena finally introduced Dante to her sister over dinner at their apartment, Sophia's suspicion was immediate and barely concealed. She asked pointed questions about his work, his background, his plans for the future. Dante deflected smoothly, using his cover story about consulting for investment firms now that his record had been cleared on appeal. But he could see that Sophia was not buying it. She had her father's instincts, that prosecutorial ability to sense when something did not add up, and Dante represented an equation that did not balance. After dinner, as Dante was leaving, Sophia cornered him in the hallway outside the apartment. She was small but fierce, her eyes hard despite her youth, and she stood close enough that her next words would not carry back inside. "I don't know who you really are," she said quietly, "but I know you're not who you're pretending to be. Elena sees the best in everyone. It's her weakness and her strength. But I see people for what they are. If you hurt my sister, I don't care how much money you have or how many connections you've made, I will dedicate my life to destroying you. Do we understand each other?" Dante met her gaze without flinching, recognizing in Sophia Torres the same fire that must have driven her father to take the stand against the Morettis, despite knowing the cost. "I understand you perfectly," he said. "And for what it's worth, I don't want to hurt Elena. That's the truth, even if nothing else I've told you is." It was perhaps the most honest thing he had said since leaving prison, and Sophia seemed to recognize it. She did not relax, did not offer friendship or approval, but she nodded slightly and stepped back, not allowing him to leave. As Dante rode the elevator down, he knew that Sophia Torres was now a problem. She was smart and suspicious, and eventually her suspicions would lead her to research, and that research might lead her to connections she should not make. He should tell Marco to have her watched more closely, to be prepared to neutralize the threat if necessary. Instead, He found himself respecting her protective instinct, wishing that Elena had someone that fierce in her corner, even if that someone was currently circling him like a predator identifying prey. 2 months into their relationship, everything changed. Dante was having dinner with Elena at a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy, a neighborhood that had once been Moretti territory before urban development and changing demographics had transformed it into something more sanitized and tourist-friendly. They were debating whether the restaurant's carbonara was authentic or adapted for American palates when Dante's phone vibrated with the specific pattern that indicated an emergency message from Marco. He excused himself to take the call outside, stepping into the cool evening air and walking far enough from the restaurant's entrance that he could not be overheard. Marco's voice was tense, controlled in the way it got when situations were spiraling toward violence. "We've got a problem. The Castellanos know about Elena. One of their soldiers saw you together last week, recognized you despite the low profile you've been keeping. They've been watching her, waiting for an opportunity." "Dante, they grabbed Sophia an hour ago. She was leaving her evening class at the law school. 2 men, a black van, professionals. They're holding her as leverage." The world narrowed to a single point of cold, focused rage. The Castellanos were rivals who had been testing Moretti territory for months, when emboldened by Dante's perceived weakness after prison, by rumors that he had gone soft, lost his edge. They were trying to provoke a war, and they had chosen the worst possible way to do it. "Where?" Dante asked, his voice deadly calm. Marco provided an address, a warehouse in Red Hook that the Castellanos used for exactly this kind of operation. He was already mobilizing their people, 20 of their best soldiers armed and ready to move. But he wanted Dante's authorization before starting a shooting war that could escalate into something that consumed multiple families. Dante gave the authorization without hesitation. Sofia Torres was innocent, a law student with no connection to their world, and she had been taken solely because of her connection to Elena, which meant because of her connection to Dante. That made her safety his responsibility, regardless of the consequences. He went back inside the restaurant where Elena was still sitting, still smiling, unaware that her world was about to shatter. Dante sat down across from her and took her hand, his grip gentle despite the violence he was planning in his mind. "Elena, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Sophia has been taken. Men from a rival organization kidnapped her to use as leverage against me. I'm going to get her back, but I need you to go home, lock your door, and wait for my call." "Can you do that?" Elena's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, terror, before landing on something harder, more focused. "Who are you?" she whispered. "What organization? What have you done?" There was no time for explanations, no way to soften the truth that was about to destroy everything between them. "I'm Dante Moretti. I run a crime family. The man who was writing you from prison was not Daniel Morrison, accountant wrongly convicted. He was me, using you to gather information about your father. But Elena, I swear to you, what started as manipulation became real. I fell in love with you, and I will get your sister back, or I will die trying." Elena pulled her hand away as if his touch burned her. The hurt and betrayal in her eyes were worse than any physical wound Dante had ever received. She stood up, stumbling slightly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made other diners look over. "You lied about everything," she said, her voice breaking. "Everything. I trusted you. I told you things I haven't told anyone. And you were just using me to get to my father? The father you tried to kill?" She ran from the restaurant before Dante could respond, and he let her go. There would be time for explanations later, or there would not be time because he would be dead. But right now, Sofia Torres needed him, and that was all that mattered. He left money on the table for a meal they had not finished and walked out into the night where Marco was waiting with the Mercedes and an arsenal in the trunk. The warehouse in Red Hook was exactly what Dante had expected: isolated, industrial, the kind of place where screams would not carry and bodies could be disposed of without witnesses. Marco had positioned their people around the perimeter, cutting off escape routes, and now they waited for Dante's signal. He checked his weapon, a 9mm that felt comfortable and familiar in his hand, despite 3 years of not holding one. And then he gave the order. The operation was brutal and efficient. Dante's people moved like the professionals they were, breaching the warehouse from 3 points simultaneously, overwhelming the Castellano soldiers before they could organize a defense. Dante moved through the chaos with purpose, following the sound of voices to a back office where Sofia Torres was tied to a chair, her face bruised, but her eyes still defiant. 3 Castellano soldiers stood around her, and they turned toward Dante with weapons raised, but they were too slow, their reflexes dulled by overconfidence. Dante shot the first 2 with the cold efficiency of long practice, but the third managed to get off a round that caught Dante in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around. He recovered and finished the job, putting the third soldier down. And then he was cutting Sofia's bonds with a knife Marco had given him, lifting her to her feet even as blood soaked through his sweater. "Are you hurt?" he asked her, checking for serious injuries beyond the obvious bruises. Sofia shook her head, staring at him with wide eyes. "You came," she said, sounding surprised despite everything. "You actually came for me." "Of course I came," Dante said, leading her toward the exit where Marco was waiting to get them out before police arrived in response to the gunfire. "You're Elena's sister. That means something, whether she believes it right now or not." They made it to the hospital before Dante's adrenaline wore off and the pain from his shoulder wound became unbearable. Marco had taken Sofia home first, ensuring she was safe with Elena before doubling back to deal with Dante's injury. The bullet had gone through cleanly, on missing bone and major arteries, a lucky shot in its unluckiness. The doctors patched him up with the practiced indifference of professionals who had learned not to ask too many questions about gunshot wounds in this particular emergency room. Elena arrived while Dante was still in recovery, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. Marco had called her after Sofia was safe, providing updates and finally the hospital location when it became clear that Dante would survive. She stood in the doorway of his room for a long moment, just looking at him, her expression unreadable. "Marco told me everything," she finally said, walking to stand beside his bed. "About who you are, about what you did to my father, about why you approached me in the first place. He told me that you chose to save Sofia even though it meant starting a war with another family, even though it put you at risk. I don't know what to do with all of this information, Dante. I don't know how to reconcile the man I fell in love with and the man who ordered a hit on my father." Dante met her gaze, not bothering to hide the pain he felt, both physical and emotional. "I can't reconcile them either," he admitted. "Daniel Morrison was a lie. But he was also who I might have been in a different life, in a world where I wasn't born into this family. When I was writing to you, when I was with you, I got to pretend I was that person. But I'm not, Elena. I'm Dante Moretti, and I've done terrible things, and I will probably do more terrible things before this is over. Your father testified against my family, and I ordered him killed for it. That's who I am. The only true thing I've told you is that I love you. That's real, even if nothing else was." Elena was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she struggled with emotions too complicated to name. "I can't be with you," she whispered. "I can't love someone who exists in your world, who does the things you do. But I also can't deny that you saved Sofia's life. You took a bullet protecting her. How am I supposed to hate you for the past when you did that for my sister?" "You're not supposed to hate me or forgive me," Dante said gently. "You're supposed to walk away and build the life you deserve, the bookstore and the quiet happiness and the man who can give you uncomplicated love. I'll make sure you and Sofia are always protected, that no one from my world ever touches you again. But we can't be together, Elena. We both know that." She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, looking simultaneously young and ancient in her sadness. "Goodbye, Dante," she said, and then she walked out of his hospital room and out of his life, leaving him alone with the machines that monitored his heartbeat and the hollow feeling that suggested maybe his heart had stopped beating when she left, and even if the machines did not know it yet. The weeks that followed were dark for Dante Moretti. He threw himself back into running his organization with a ruthlessness that made even Marco concerned. The war with the Castellanos escalated. Territory changed hands, bodies turned up in industrial areas and riverside parks. Dante conducted business with cold efficiency, eliminating obstacles and building power, becoming exactly what people feared when they heard the name Moretti. But at night, alone in his apartment, he read and reread the letters Elena had written to him in prison, trying to remember what it had felt like to be Daniel Morrison, to be someone capable of deserving love. 3 months had passed since the night everything fell apart, and Elena Torres had learned that heartbreak was not a single moment, but rather a series of small deaths that happened every day. She had opened her bookstore finally, using insurance money from her father's estate that she had not even known existed until the lawyers tracked her down. The store was small, tucked into a corner of the West Village not far from where she had first met Dante, and she had named it Second Chapters, both a literary reference and a personal statement about starting over. The shelves were filled with carefully curated books, the chairs were comfortable and mismatched, and there was always fresh coffee brewing in the back. It was everything she had dreamed of, and it felt hollow in a way she had not anticipated. Sophia visited the store every afternoon after her classes, studying at the corner table that Elena kept reserved for her, her law books spread out like battle plans. The kidnapping had changed Sophia in subtle ways that worried Elena. Her sister had always been fierce, but now there was a hardness in her eyes, a watchfulness that suggested she saw threats everywhere. She had taken to studying criminal law with renewed intensity, focusing on organized crime and RICO statutes, as if understanding the system that had nearly killed her would somehow give her control over it. Elena suspected that Sophia was also researching Dante Moretti, though her sister never mentioned his name, never brought up that night except in the oblique references that passed between them like coded messages. The sisters had grown closer in the aftermath of the trauma, but there was also a new distance between them, created by the fact that Elena had fallen in love with the man who operated in the same world that had targeted Sophia. They did not talk about Dante directly, but his absence was a presence in every conversation, a ghost that haunted their silences. Elena knew that Sophia did not entirely blame Dante for what had happened. The Castellanos had made the choice to take her, but had acted on their own violent impulses. But she also knew that Sophia would never forgive him for lying to Elena, for manipulating her sister's kindness for his own purposes. What Elena had not told Sophia, what she had barely admitted to herself in the quiet hours before dawn, was that she still loved Dante Moretti. She hated him for his lies and his violence and the casual way he existed in a world that destroyed people. But love apparently did not obey the rational commands of the mind. She dreamed about him most nights, sometimes the sweet dreams of their time together, sometimes nightmares where he stood over her father with a gun, sometimes confused amalgamations where Daniel Morrison and Dante Moretti were different people fighting for space in the same body. She woke from these dreams tangled in sheets, her heart racing, feeling guilty for wanting something she could not have, should not want. Marco Santini came to the bookstore on a Tuesday afternoon in February, on the winter light watery and weak through the store's front window. Elena recognized him immediately from the night at the hospital, and her first instinct was to ask him to leave, to maintain the boundary she had drawn between her life and Dante's world. But there was something in Marco's expression, a combination of respect and purpose, that made her pause. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Marco said quietly, glancing around the empty store. "I just need 5 minutes of your time, Elena. It's about your father." The mention of Roberto Torres pulled Elena back to the counter where she had been organizing new arrivals. "What about my father?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I haven't heard from him in 5 years. As far as I'm concerned, he made his choice when he entered witness protection." Marco pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it on the counter between them. "He's back in New York," he said. "He came out of witness protection 2 weeks ago. Terminal cancer, late stage. The FBI convinced him to testify one more time, to take down several families including the Morettis, and in exchange, they're helping him reconcile with his daughters before he dies. He's been trying to work up the courage to contact you." Elena stared at the envelope without touching it, as if it might explode if she made contact. "How do you know this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because finding people is what we do," Marco said without apology. "Roberto Torres has been on our radar since he first testified against Dante's family. When he emerged from witness protection, we knew within 24 hours. I'm telling you this because Dante asked me to. He wanted you to be prepared, to not be blindsided when your father shows up. And because, despite what you might think, Dante is not going to touch your father. He could have, multiple times in the past 2 weeks, but he has not given the order. That's not business, Elena. That's personal, and it's for you." The envelope remained on the counter after Marco left, unopened for the rest of the day. Elena moved around it like it was a live thing, dangerous and unpredictable, while she helped customers and organized shelves and tried not to think about what was inside. When she finally locked the store's door at 9 o'clock, exhausted from pretending everything was normal, she sat in the reading nook by the window and opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter in handwriting she barely remembered, spidery and uncertain in a way that suggested the cancer had already taken its toll. Roberto Torres wrote that he was dying, that he had perhaps 3 months left, and that his greatest regret was leaving his daughters without explanation. He tried to explain his choice, the threats the FBI had described against Elena and Sofia if he did not cooperate, the fear that had driven him into hiding, the shame that had kept him there even after the immediate danger had passed. He wrote that he was a coward, that he should have fought to stay with them, or at least fought to bring them with him, and that he understood if they could not forgive him. But he was asking anyway, begging really, for a chance to see them one more time, to say goodbye properly, to try to answer the questions he knew must have haunted them for 5 years. Elena read the letter 3 times, her emotions cycling between anger and pity and a tired kind of grief for the relationship they should have had. She thought about the Elena from 5 years ago, 23 years old and suddenly responsible for an 18-year-old sister, trying to pay rent and buy groceries on a library assistant's salary, while wondering what she had done to make her father leave. She thought about Sofia, brilliant and fierce Sofia, who had learned not to trust anyone who claimed to love her because the first man who was supposed to love her unconditionally had chosen his own safety over hers. When she called Sofia that night, reading the letter over the phone, in a voice that shook despite her efforts at control, her sister's response was immediate and harsh. "No," Sofia said. "I don't care if he's dying. He left us, Elena. He made his choice. Why should we give him the comfort of forgiveness just so he can die with a clear conscience? He doesn't deserve that." But Elena found that she could not be quite so absolute in her rejection. "Maybe it's not about what he deserves," she said quietly. "Maybe it's about what we need. Don't you want answers, Sofia? Don't you want to know why? To hear it from him instead of just guessing for the rest of our lives?" They argued for an hour, their voices rising and falling with emotion. Until finally, Sofia agreed to meet their father once, just once, but only if Elena was there too. They arranged it for the following Sunday afternoon at a diner in Queens that was neutral territory, public enough that they could leave if it became too much. Roberto Torres agreed immediately when Elena called the number on the letter, his voice thin and grateful, promising he would answer any question they had, would accept any anger they needed to express. Sunday arrived with the kind of bright, cold sunshine that made everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving. Elena and Sofia took the subway to Queens together, neither of them speaking much, both lost in thoughts about what they would say, how they would react. When they walked into the diner, they saw him immediately, a man who looked 20 years older than the father they remembered, gaunt and gray, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted a coffee cup to his lips. He stood when he saw them, his expression a mixture of hope and terror, and Elena felt Sofia stiffen beside her, felt her sister's hand grab hers with painful intensity. They sat in the booth across from their father, and for a long moment no one spoke. Roberto Torres seemed to be drinking them in, memorizing their faces, tears streaming down his cheeks without apparent awareness. "You both look so much like your mother," he finally said, his voice breaking. "She would be so proud of the women you've become." Sophia's laugh was bitter, sharp as broken glass. "Our mother died when I was 10, she said. "You're the one who raised us, until you decided we weren't worth the inconvenience. So don't talk about Mom right now. Talk about why you left. Talk about why we weren't enough to make you stay." What followed was 3 hours of painful honesty, questions asked and answered, anger expressed and received. Roberto Torres explained the fear that had driven him into witness protection, the graphic threats federal agents had described against his daughters, the belief that his presence endangered them. He talked about the shame that had paralyzed him once he was in hiding, the inability to reach out even when the immediate danger had passed because he did not know how to explain his choice, how to ask forgiveness for the unforgivable. He admitted that he had been a coward, that he had chosen the easier path of abandonment over the harder path of fighting to protect his family while staying with them. Elena listened to all of it, her own anger a quieter thing than Sophia's fury, but no less profound. She asked her father about the morning he left, whether he had hesitated at all, whether he had looked back. Roberto admitted that he had not, that he had been so consumed by fear and urgency that he had simply run, and that his greatest regret was not that single moment, but all the moments that followed, the birthdays and holidays and ordinary days when he should have been present and was not. When Sophia asked about the new testimony, about why their father was willing to risk his life again for a system that had failed to protect him the first time, Roberto's answer was simple and devastating. "Because I'm dying anyway," he said, "and this is the only way I can think of to give you something. The FBI is offering a substantial witness compensation package, money that will go to you and Elena after I'm gone. It's not enough, it could never be enough, but it's something. And maybe, if my testimony takes down the people who have made this city dangerous, who have hurt people like you girls, then my life will have meant something beyond my failures as a father." Elena felt something crack inside her chest at these words, felt the anger that had sustained her for 5 years begin to crumble into something more complicated. She looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw not the hero prosecutor she had idolized as a child, or the coward who had abandoned them, but rather a flawed, frightened man who had made terrible choices and was trying, inadequately, to make amends. It did not forgive what he had done, but it made him human in a way that was harder to hate. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Elena said quietly, her words cutting through Sophia's continued accusations. "What you did hurt us in ways I'm not sure I can fully articulate, but I also don't know if I can spend whatever time you have left being angry. So maybe we can try something in between. Maybe we can try to be honest with each other, to ask questions and give answers, and see if that's enough." Sophia looked at Elena with betrayal in her eyes, but before she could protest, their father spoke again, his voice urgent. "There's something else you need to know," he said. "The man you were seeing, Elena. Daniel Morrison, except that is not his real name. He's Dante Moretti. I recognized him from photos in your apartment when I was there last week, watching from across the street because I was not brave enough to knock on your door. He's the one who ordered the hit on me 5 years ago. He's the reason I went into witness protection. And you need to stay away from him. Both of you. The Morettis are dangerous, and Dante is the most dangerous of all." Elena felt the blood drain from her face, the diner suddenly too bright and too loud. "I know who he is," she said quietly. "I figured it out 3 months ago, when Sophia was taken by one of his rivals. He saved her life, Dad. He took a bullet protecting her from the Castellanos. So maybe your information about the Morettis is not as complete as you think." The conversation that followed was chaotic. Roberto Torres insisting that Elena did not understand what she was dealing with, that Dante Moretti was a killer who could not be trusted, that his apparent care for Sophia was likely manipulation, designed to further some agenda Elena could not see. Sophia sided with their father on this, her experience with Dante's world making her deeply suspicious of his motives. Elena found herself in the strange position of defending the man who had broken her heart, arguing that whatever Dante's crimes, he had shown up when it mattered, had risked his life for someone who meant nothing to his organization except that she was connected to Elena. They left the diner with no resolution, with more questions than answers, and with a plan to meet again the following week. As Elena and Sophia rode the subway back to Manhattan, the silence between them was tense and uncomfortable. Finally, Sophia spoke, her voice low and intense. "You still love him?" she said, not a question but an accusation. "After everything he's done, everything he lied about, you still love Dante Moretti?" Elena could not deny it, though the admission felt like a betrayal of herself, of her sister, of everything she thought she believed about right and wrong. "I don't want to love him," she said, staring at their reflection in the dark subway window. "But feelings don't obey logic, Sophia. I hate what he is and what he does, but I also remember who he was with me, the conversations we had, the way he saw me. Maybe that person was a lie, but it did not feel like a lie when I was with him." Sophia's response was interrupted by her phone buzzing with an urgent alert. She pulled it out, her face going pale as she read the notification. "It's happening," she said, showing Elena the screen. "The FBI raids. They are hitting 5 families simultaneously, using Dad's testimony as the foundation. The Morettis, the Castellanos, the Lucianos, the Gambettis, and the Russos. It's all over the news. Dante Moretti was arrested an hour ago." Elena felt her heart stop, felt the world tilt sideways despite the subway's steady movement. Without thinking about what she was doing or why, she pulled out her own phone and searched for news about the arrests. There he was on her screen, Dante being led in handcuffs from a restaurant where he had apparently been having dinner, his face calm and controlled even as federal agents surrounded him. The news described it as the largest coordinated strike against organized crime in New York history, with over 200 arrests expected before the night was over. She should have felt relief, or vindication, or satisfaction that justice was being served. Instead, Elena felt only a profound sense of loss, as if something essential had been torn away from the world, leaving it diminished. She thought about Dante reading in his cell, and about the man who had quoted Neruda and discussed Rothko paintings, about the person he had been in their letters before she knew his real name. That person had been real in some fundamental way, she was certain of it, even if everything else had been lies. "I need to see him," Elena said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Sophia stared at her as if she had suggested jumping in front of the train. "Are you insane?" "Elena, he is a criminal. He tried to kill our father. He lied to you about everything. Why would you possibly want to see him?" But Elena could not explain it in a way that would make sense to anyone else, possibly not even to herself. She only knew that Dante was locked in a cell facing life imprisonment or worse, and that she needed to understand what she felt. We needed to look him in the eyes one more time and decide if the connection between them had been real, or just an elaborate fantasy she had constructed to avoid the loneliness of her own life. It took 3 days to get visitation approval, 3 days during which Elena barely slept, her mind cycling through imagined conversations and rehearsed speeches that all sounded hollow when she practiced them aloud. Sophia tried to talk her out of going, argued that seeing Dante would only make things worse, but Elena was resolute in a way she had not been about anything in months. Marco Santini called her once during those 3 days, his voice carefully neutral, as he told her that Dante had not asked to see her, that in fact he had specifically said Elena should not come, that she should move on with her life and forget about him. This information made Elena more determined rather than less, convinced that Dante was trying to protect her by pushing her away. The detention center was as bleak and institutional as Elena had expected, all concrete and steel and the peculiar smell of too many humans confined in too little space. She went through security with the other visitors, mostly women and children coming to see fathers and brothers and husbands, all of them wearing expressions of tired resignation that suggested this was routine for them. Elena felt like an intruder in their world, her naivety about the criminal justice system obvious in her uncertainty about procedures, in the way she flinched when metal doors clanged shut behind her. When they brought Dante into the visiting room and seated him across from her with bulletproof glass between them, Elena felt her rehearsed words evaporate. He looked thinner than she remembered, the prison jumpsuit hanging loose on his frame, his face harder with new shadows under his eyes. But when he really saw her sitting there with the phone in her hand, waiting for him to pick up his own, his expression cracked into something unguarded and painful, a glimpse of the vulnerability he worked so hard to hide. "You should not be here," Dante said into the phone, his voice distorted by the connection, but still unmistakably his. "I told Marco to tell you not to come. Elena, you need to forget about me and build your life. Whatever we had, whatever I felt, it's over. I'm looking at 20 years minimum, possibly life. There's nothing here for you except pain." Elena met his gaze through the glass, refusing to look away even though the intensity of his eyes made her want to. "I came because I needed to understand something," she said. "Was any of it real, Dante? When you wrote to me from prison, when we talked in coffee shops and walked through museums, was there any part of that which was true? Or was I just completely fooled by a man who is very good at lying?" Dante was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was physically holding back words. Finally, he leaned closer to the glass, his voice low and rough. "It was real," he said. "Not the circumstances, not the reasons I approached you, but what happened between us was real. I have lied about many things in my life, Elena. I have pretended to feel things I did not feel, played roles to manipulate people, or used charm as a weapon. But with you, I did not have to pretend. Daniel Morrison was a name I invented, but he was also who I am underneath the choices and violence of my actual life. When I was with you, I got to be that person. So yes, it was real. Maybe the most real thing I have ever experienced. And that is exactly why you need to leave and never come back." "Why?" Elena asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Why do I need to leave if it was real?" "Because I will destroy you," Dante said bluntly, his words harsh but his eyes anguished. "Everyone I care about gets hurt, Elena. It is the cost of being connected to me. My world is violent and cruel, and it does not make exceptions for innocence. You got a taste of that when Sophia was taken, but that was nothing compared to what will happen if you stay in my life. Rival families will target you to get to me. Federal agents will pressure you to testify. My own organization will see you as a potential weakness to exploit, and I will not be able to protect you, not from prison, possibly not even if I were free. So please, for your own sake, walk away now while you still can." Elena felt tears running down her face, though she had not been aware of crying. "What if I don't want to walk away?" she asked quietly. "What if I want to fight for this, for us, even if it's complicated and dangerous and probably impossible?" Dante closed his eyes, his hand pressed against the glass as if he could touch her through it. "Then you would be making a mistake," he said, opening his eyes again to look at her with devastating honesty. "I am not worth fighting for, Elena. I have killed people. I have ordered violence against innocents. I tried to have your father murdered. These are not things that get erased by love or redemption arcs. This is who I am, and it is who I will always be, even if I wanted to change. The best thing I can do for you is let you go." They sat in silence, the phone receivers pressed to their ears, looking at each other through glass that might as well have been an ocean. Elena tried to memorize his face, the exact shade of his eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead. She tried to capture this moment because she knew, even as she was living it, that it was an ending, that walking away from this visiting room would mean walking away from Dante Moretti forever. "I need you to know something," Elena finally said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I don't forgive you for lying to me. I don't excuse the things you've done or pretend that love conquers the reality of who you are. But I also don't regret knowing you, even if it hurts like this. You made me feel seen in a way no one else has. You challenged me and listened to me and made me believe that connection was possible. So thank you for that, even if everything else was broken." She hung up the phone before Dante could respond, standing and walking toward the exit without looking back. Behind her, she knew Dante was still sitting there, still watching her leave, but she did not turn around. If she turned around, she would not be able to leave. And leaving was the only choice that made sense, the only path that did not lead to destruction. Outside the detention center, Sophia was waiting in the car, her expression sympathetic, despite her continued disapproval of Elena's decision to visit Dante. They drove back to Manhattan in silence, and Elena stared out the window at the city passing by, thinking about the various ways people could be imprisoned, how bars and walls were not the only things that trapped you. The following weeks were difficult in ways Elena had not anticipated. Knowing that Dante was locked away should have made it easier to move forward, to focus on her bookstore and her relationship with her slowly dying father and the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Instead, she found herself unable to stop thinking about him, unable to stop imagining what he was doing in his cell, whether he thought about her too, the letters she had saved from their correspondence, all the ones signed Daniel Morrison, felt like artifacts from someone else's life, precious and painful in equal measure. Her father's testimony made national news, and the details of his statements against the 5 families devastating in their specificity and scope. Roberto Torres had spent 5 years in hiding, but he had also spent those years documenting everything he had learned as a prosecutor, building a case that connected decades of organized crime to specific individuals and operations. The trials would take years, but the foundations were being laid for convictions that would reshape the criminal landscape of New York. Elena met with her father twice more before he was hospitalized for the final time. Their conversations remained difficult, full of silences and careful navigation of topics too painful to address directly. But there was also a tentative peace being built, an acknowledgement that imperfect love was still love. Sophia remained more distant with Roberto, her anger harder to soften, but she came to the hospital when their father was dying, and she held his hand in the end, and that would have to be enough. At the funeral, attended only by Elena, Sophia, and a few of Roberto's former colleagues, Elena found herself thinking about forgiveness and second chances, about whether people could truly change, or if they just became better at hiding who they really were. She thought about her father, who had been both hero and coward, who had saved her life by leaving and destroyed it, by leaving in equal measure. She thought about Dante, who had lied to her and used her, and also loved her with an intensity that felt like its own kind of truth. The bookstore kept her busy through the grief and confusion, the daily tasks of running a business providing structure when everything else felt formless. She curated new sections, hosted reading groups, hired part-time help so she could actually take breaks. Second Chapters was becoming what she had always envisioned, a community space where people found not just books, but connection. So conversation, the recognition that they were not alone in their stories. It was in the bookstore, 3 months after her visit to the detention center, that Elena received unexpected news that would change everything once again. A woman came in, middle-aged and professional, introducing herself as Sarah Chen, a federal prosecutor. She asked if they could speak privately, and something in her manner made Elena nervous enough to agree, and leading her to the small office in the back where Elena did paperwork and drank too much coffee. "I'm here to talk to you about Dante Moretti," Sarah Chen said without preamble once the door was closed. "Specifically, about some discrepancies in the evidence against him. My office has been reviewing your father's testimony, and we've discovered that some of it was obtained through coercion. Federal agents threatened your father's safety, implied that you and your sister would be harmed if he didn't cooperate, pushed him to embellish certain details to strengthen the case. This is a serious violation of protocol, and it potentially taints the entire prosecution." Elena felt her heart begin to race, though she did not understand yet where this was leading. "What does that mean?" she asked carefully. "For my father's testimony? For the trials?" Sarah Chen leaned forward, her expression intense. "It means that every conviction based on your father's testimony could be challenged. It means that the evidence might be inadmissible, that defendants could walk free on technicalities. And it means that I need to know if you're willing to testify about what your father told you regarding how he was treated by federal agents. Your testimony could help us understand the scope of the misconduct, could potentially save some cases while acknowledging that others are too compromised to pursue. Elena thought about the conversations she had had with her father before he died, the things he had confessed about the FBI's tactics, the pressure he had felt to deliver testimony that would justify their protection of him. She thought about justice and truth, about systems that were supposed to protect but often just traded one kind of corruption for another. And she thought about Dante. I locked away based partly on evidence that might be tainted, convicted not just for what he had done, but for what he represented. The convenient target in a system that needed wins more than it needed accuracy. I'll testify, Elena said quietly. Not to help Dante specifically, but because the truth matters more than convenient convictions. If my father's testimony was coerced, if evidence was gathered improperly, then that needs to be acknowledged, regardless of who benefits. The trials that followed were lengthy and complicated, with Elena called to testify about her father's state of mind, about the things he had told her regarding FBI pressure and manipulation. She spoke honestly about the fear her father had expressed, about the way agents had used his love for his daughters against him, threatening their safety to secure more detailed testimony than he might otherwise have given. Her testimony did not exonerate any of the defendants, but it did force a reckoning with the methods used to convict them. In Dante's case specifically, the revelations about Roberto Torres's coerced testimony were devastating to the prosecution. Much of the evidence against Dante had been built on connections that Roberto had described under pressure, links between criminal activities that may have been exaggerated or fabricated to satisfy the agents who controlled his safety. The judge ruled that significant portions of the testimony were inadmissible, which meant that the charges against Dante had to be reduced. Instead of life imprisonment, he was looking at a sentence of 5 years with possibility of parole, credit for time served. Elena learned about the ruling from the news like everyone else, watching a press conference where Sarah Chen explained the difficult decision to reduce charges while maintaining that Dante Moretti was still guilty of serious crimes. She felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Relief that Dante would not spend the rest of his life in prison. Guilt that her testimony had helped him when he had tried to kill her father. Confusion about whether justice had been served or merely compromised. Marco Santini called her that evening, his voice carefully neutral. Dante wanted me to thank you, he said, for testifying honestly, even though it helped him. He knows what it cost you, knows that it complicated your relationship with your father's memory. He wants you to know that he's using this second chance to legitimize the family's business interests, to move away from the criminal operations that defined his father's generation. It's not redemption, he knows that, but it's something. Elena listened to this message, holding her phone with both hands, staring at the bookstore around her that represented her own second chance. When does he get out? She asked, though she was not sure why she needed to know. 3 years, Marco said, with good behavior and the time he has already served. 3 years, and then he will be free to rebuild his life. He asked me to tell you that he is not expecting anything from you, that he understands if you have moved on. But he wanted you to know that what you did mattered, that it gave him a chance he thought he had lost. After Marco hung up, Elena sat in the quiet bookstore. He's surrounded by stories of other people's lives, other people's loves and losses and second chances. She thought about 3 years, about how long that was and how short, about whether people could truly change or if they just became better versions of who they always were. She thought about waiting and not waiting, about hope and realism, about the various ways we imprison ourselves with the choices we make and the stories we tell about those choices. Sophia found her there an hour later, closing time long past, sitting in the dark with only the streetlights providing illumination. Her sister sat down beside her without speaking, just being present in the way they had learned to do for each other through all the upheavals of their lives. Finally, Sophia spoke, her voice soft in the darkness. I've been thinking about what Dante did, she said carefully. Saving me, I mean. I've spent months trying to reconcile that action with everything else I know about him. I'm trying to understand how someone who orders violence can also risk their life to protect a stranger, And I think maybe people are just more complicated than we want them to be. Maybe they can be both terrible and good, both dangerous and protective. It doesn't excuse the terrible things, but it also doesn't erase the good ones. Elena reached for Sophia's hand, grateful for her sister's presence, for the forgiveness implicit in her words. "I don't know what I'm going to do when he gets out," Elena admitted. "I don't know if I can be with someone who exists in his world, if I can accept that kind of violence as part of my life. But I also can't pretend that I've stopped loving him, that these 3 years will somehow make that feeling disappear." "Then don't decide now," Sophia said simply. "Wait and see who he becomes when he gets out. Wait and see who you become in the meantime. 3 years is a long time, Elena. You both might be completely different people by then. And maybe those future versions of you can figure out something that seems impossible right now." It was wisdom beyond Sophia's years, born from their shared experiences of loss and survival, and Elena held on to it like a lifeline in the uncertain waters of her future. Time moved differently when you were waiting for something, Elena discovered. The 3 years between Dante's sentencing and his potential release stretched out like elastic, on some days passing in a blur of bookstore business and normal life, other days crawling by with excruciating slowness as Elena found herself thinking about what would happen when he was finally free. She did not write to him. They had agreed, through Marco, that a clean break was healthier than maintaining connection that might prevent either of them from moving forward. But she thought about him constantly, wondering if he was thinking about her too, and wondering if 3 years would change what they had felt into something else entirely, something manageable and forgotten. The bookstore thrived during those years. Second Chapters became exactly the community hub Elena had envisioned, hosting author readings and book clubs, poetry nights and writing workshops. She hired 3 part-time employees, all of them passionate about literature in ways that made work feel less like work and more like a continuation of endless conversations about stories and meaning. The financial success surprised her. She had expected to barely break even for years. But it turned out there was hunger in the neighborhood for the kind of curated, thoughtful space she had created. Sophia graduated from law school at the top of her class and took a position with a nonprofit that focused on criminal justice reform, specifically working to change sentencing guidelines and prison conditions. The irony of Sofia Torres, daughter of a murdered prosecutor and victim of a Mafia kidnapping, dedicating her career to helping incarcerated people, was not lost on anyone, but Sofia attacked the work with characteristic intensity. She had come to believe through her research and her own experiences that the criminal justice system was fundamentally broken, that it created more violence than it prevented, and that true safety came not from punishment, but from addressing the economic and social conditions that pushed people toward crime. The sisters remained close, their shared trauma binding them in ways that were both beautiful and complicated. They had dinner together twice a week, alternating between Elena's apartment and Sophia's smaller place in Brooklyn. They talked about everything and nothing, supporting each other through relationships that came and went, through career victories and frustrations, through the ordinary difficulties of building adult lives from the wreckage of their fractured childhood. They did not often speak about Dante directly, but his absence was a presence they both acknowledged in oblique ways. Elena dated occasionally during those 3 years, mostly men she met through bookstore events or friends of friends, earnest intellectuals who loved literature and treated her with respect. None of these relationships progressed beyond a few months. She told herself it was because she was too busy with the bookstore, because she valued her independence, because she had not met the right person yet. But in honest moments, usually late at night when she could not sleep, Elena admitted that she was still in love with Dante Moretti, that she was still waiting even though she had not consciously decided to wait, that her heart had made a choice her mind could not rationalize or override. Marco Santini stopped by the bookstore every few months, ostensibly to buy books, actually to provide updates on Dante that Elena had not asked for, but secretly craved. Marco told her that Dante was using his time in prison to legitimize the Moretti family's business interests, transitioning from criminal operations into real estate development, construction companies, restaurant chains. The transition was not smooth. There was resistance from old guard members who saw legitimate business as weakness. There were complications with rival families who resented the Moretti's attempts to go clean, but Dante was persistent and strategic, using the same skills that had made him successful in crime to build something legal. "He's different," Marco told Elena during one of his visits, about 18 months into Dante's sentence. "Harder in some ways, more ruthless about cutting ties with people who won't make the transition, but also softer in others. He started a program inside the prison, teaching financial literacy to other inmates, helping them understand how to build legitimate businesses when they get out. He reads constantly, everything from philosophy to urban planning to social justice theory. It's like he's trying to become someone new, or maybe trying to become someone he should have been all along." Elena listened to these updates with hungry attention, trying to build a picture of who Dante was becoming during these years apart. She wondered if he knew that Marco was reporting back to her, if he had perhaps asked Marco to keep her informed, or if Marco was acting on his own instinct that these two people needed to remain connected even while they were separated. She never asked, afraid of the answer either way. In the third year, as Dante's release date approached, Elena found herself becoming anxious in ways she had not anticipated. She lay awake at night, rehearsing potential conversations, imagining scenarios where they reunited and it was perfect, or where they reunited and realized they had built entirely different lives that no longer intersected. She lost weight from stress, became short-tempered with her employees, caught herself staring into space during book club discussions. Sophia noticed, Mas of course, and finally confronted her one evening over dinner. "You need to decide what you're going to do," Sophia said bluntly, setting down her fork and looking at Elena with the directness that had become her trademark. "Dante gets out in 4 months. Are you going to see him? Are you going to try to make something work? Or are you going to finally move on with your life? Because this limbo state you've been in for 3 years is not healthy, Elena. You've been on pause, waiting for something that might not even happen." Elena pushed food around her plate, not meeting her sister's eyes. "I don't know what I want," she admitted quietly. "Part of me thinks I'm crazy for even considering giving him another chance. He lied to me, manipulated me, tried to kill our father. Those aren't small things, Sophia. Those are fundamental character revelations that should make me run in the opposite direction. But another part of me remembers how I felt when I was with him. How seen and understood I was, how alive. And I keep thinking that if he's really changed, if he's really left that life behind, then maybe we deserve a chance to find out what we could be without all the lies between us." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I've spent 3 years working with people who have done terrible things," she finally said. "I've seen people who genuinely change, and people who just get better at pretending to be different. The ones who really change share certain characteristics. They take full responsibility for what they've done without excuses. They make amends where possible. They build new lives that don't just avoid their old patterns, but actively counter them. From what Marco tells you, it sounds like Dante might be doing that. But you won't know until you actually talk to him, until you see him outside the context of prison and performance." It was good advice, typical Sophia in its pragmatism and clarity. But Elena still felt paralyzed by indecision, unable to commit to seeing Dante, but also unable to fully let go of the possibility. The resolution to this paralysis came from an unexpected source, in a way that forced Elena's hand before she had time to overthink it further. 2 months before Dante's scheduled release, Elena was working late at the bookstore, going through inventory in the back office, when she heard the front door chime indicating someone had entered. She walked out to the main floor, prepared to tell whoever it was that they were closed, and stopped short when she saw the man standing in the center of the store, looking around at the shelves with an expression of wonder mixed with something harder to define. Roberto Torres stood there, except of course it was not Roberto Torres because her father was dead, buried for almost 3 years now. But the resemblance was so strong that Elena actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The man turned at the sound, and she saw that he was younger than her father would have been, perhaps 40, with the same build and coloring but different features when you looked closely. "Elena Torres?" the man asked, his voice tentative. I'm Joseph Torres, Roberto's younger brother. Your uncle, though I understand if you don't remember me. It's been many years since I saw you last. Elena did vaguely remember an Uncle Joe from her childhood. A man who had visited occasionally before some family dispute had created distance between him and her father. She gestured for him to sit in one of the reading chairs, her heart still racing from the shock of resemblance, and took the chair across from him. I'm sorry to arrive unannounced, Joseph said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. But I have some information that your father asked me to give you. Information he entrusted to me before he died with instructions that I wait 3 years before sharing it. I don't fully understand his reasoning, but Roberto was always strategic in ways I did not always appreciate. He said that 3 years would be enough time for perspectives to shift, for emotions to settle, for you to be able to hear what he needed to say. The envelope contained a letter, pages and pages in Roberto's increasingly shaky handwriting, written during the final weeks of his life. Elena read it while Joseph waited patiently, his eyes politely averted to give her privacy even while he remained in the room. The letter was a confession and an explanation, Roberto's attempt to provide context for decisions he had made throughout his life, decisions that had affected Elena and Sofia in ways he had not always understood at the time. Roberto wrote about his younger self, the ambitious prosecutor who had believed that law and justice were the same thing, who had pursued criminals with righteous fury and little regard for nuance or complexity. He wrote about the first time he testified against the Moretti family, how proud he had been to strike a blow against organized crime, how certain he had been that he was on the side of good. But he also wrote about what he learned later, about the FBI agents who had coerced his testimony, who had threatened his family to secure his cooperation, who had cared more about high-profile convictions than about truth or proper procedure. The most devastating part of the letter described the night Roberto had been shot, the failed hit that had sent him into witness protection. He wrote that as he lay bleeding in the street waiting for the ambulance, he had replayed his life and realized that his dedication to justice had actually been arrogance. His certainty about right and wrong had been simplistic thinking that ignored the complicated realities of how systems actually worked. He had sent men to prison who were guilty of crimes, yes, but he had also destroyed families, created vacuums of power that were filled by people more violent than those he had helped convict, and he had done it all while telling himself he was a hero. But the part of the letter that made Elena's hands shake was the section about Dante Moretti specifically. Roberto wrote that during his years in witness protection he had continued to monitor the families he had testified against, tracking their activities through federal reports and news coverage. He had watched as Dante Moretti, after ordering the failed hit on Roberto, had actually begun to change the nature of the Moretti organization. Under Dante's leadership, the family had reduced its involvement in drug trafficking and human trafficking, two of the most damaging aspects of organized crime. Dante had pushed toward more white-collar crimes, which were terrible, but less immediately violent, and even within that framework had begun exploring legitimate business opportunities. Roberto wrote that he had come to believe, based on his observations and his later conversations with federal agents who were themselves conflicted, that Dante Moretti represented a potential off-ramp from generational crime. Men like Dante, educated and strategic, could theoretically transition their organizations away from violence if given the right incentives and opportunities. Roberto had even advocated quietly and without success for the FBI to consider working with Dante rather than simply prosecuting him, to facilitate the Moretti's exit from crime rather than destroying them and creating space for more violent organizations to fill the void. The letter concluded with Roberto's blessing, as strange as that seemed. He wrote that if Elena was still involved with Dante Moretti, if she still loved him after everything that had happened, then Roberto wanted her to know that he understood, that he did not judge her choice, that he actually thought Dante might be worthy of that love if he followed through on the changes he had begun. It was not absolution. Roberto acknowledged that Dante had ordered his death and that such actions should not be easily forgiven. But it was recognition that people and situations were complicated, that justice and love operated by different rules, and that Elena should follow her heart, even if her heart led her to places that seemed impossible. Elena read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, before finally looking up at her uncle. "Why did he wait 3 years to tell me this?" she asked, her voice rough. Why not just say it before he died? Joseph shrugged, his expression sympathetic. Roberto said you needed time to hate Dante Moretti without interference, time to work through your anger and betrayal. He said that if he told you immediately that he forgave Dante or understood your feelings, it would complicate your processing, would make you feel obligated to forgive too quickly. 3 years was arbitrary, but it was his best guess at how long you would need to reach your own conclusions before his opinion would be helpful rather than coercive. It was so typically Roberto, so strategic and calculated even in matters of the heart, that Elena almost laughed through her tears. Her father had been trying to protect her even in death, trying to give her space to make her own choices while also providing the information that might influence those choices once she was ready to hear it. Whether it was manipulation or love, Elena could not entirely decide, but she found that she was grateful for the letter regardless. She thanked Joseph, who gave her his contact information and extended an awkward but genuine invitation to rebuild their family connection if she was interested. After he left, Elena sat alone in the bookstore, surrounded by books and the dim overhead lights she had forgotten to turn off properly, and thought about forgiveness and second chances, and about the various ways people could be wrong and right simultaneously, about how nothing was ever as simple as she wanted it to be. She called Sophia immediately, reading the letter over the phone, listening to her sister's silence as she processed their father's words. When Elena finished, Sophia was quiet for so long that Elena thought the call might have dropped. Finally, Sophia spoke, her voice thoughtful. "I think Dad was giving you permission to make whatever choice feels right for you," she said. "He was saying that it's okay to love Dante despite his crimes, that it doesn't make you foolish or weak or a betrayer of Dad's memory. And I think, for what it's worth, I agree with him. You should at least talk to Dante when he gets out. See who he is now, see who you are now, and figure out if there's still something there worth pursuing." 2 months later, Elena stood outside the prison facility at dawn, waiting for Dante to be released. Marco had offered to pick him up, but Dante had declined, had arranged instead for a car service, had apparently not expected anyone to be there at all. But Elena had decided, after reading her father's letter and talking with Sophia and spending weeks wrestling with her own complicated feelings, that she needed to be there, needed to see Dante's face when he walked out, needed to know immediately if the connection between them had survived 3 years of separation. The sun was just beginning to rise when the door opened and Dante walked out, carrying a single bag with his possessions, wearing civilian clothes that looked new and slightly uncomfortable on his frame. He was thinner than Elena remembered, his face more lined, his hair shorter, and showing gray at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than old. He paused when he saw her standing beside the car, his expression cycling through surprise and hope and caution before settling on something unguarded and vulnerable. "You came," he said simply, walking toward her slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might cause her to disappear. "I came," Elena confirmed, and then they were standing face to face for the first time in 3 years, just looking at each other, trying to reconcile memory with reality. Dante reached out tentatively, touching her face with gentle fingers as if confirming she was real. "I told Marco not to tell you when I was being released," he said quietly. "I thought it would be easier for both of us if we didn't have this moment, if we could just move on with separate lives and remember what we had as something beautiful but finished. But God, Elena, I'm so glad you're here. I've thought about you every single day for 3 years. You were what kept me going when everything felt impossible." Elena felt tears running down her face again, though she had promised herself she would not cry. "I got a letter from my father," she said, pulling the envelope from her bag. "He wrote it before he died, but he asked his brother to give it to me after 3 years. He wrote about you, about the changes he saw you trying to make. He said that if I still loved you, I should pursue that he understood and didn't judge me for it. So I'm here, Dante. I'm here because I never stopped loving you, even when I wanted to, even when it would have been easier. But I need to know if you've really changed, if you've really left that life behind, because I can't be with the man who ordered my father killed. I can only be with someone who's become different." Dante took the letter, reading it quickly while Elena watched emotions play across his face. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to her, in his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have changed," he said. "Not completely. I'm still the same person with the same history, and I can't erase the things I've done. But I've spent 3 years building something different. The Moretti family still exists, but we're legitimate now. Real estate, construction, restaurants, security consulting. We employ people legally, we pay taxes, we follow regulations. It's not perfect. And there are still connections to the old world that I have to manage carefully. But we're not criminals anymore, Elena. I'm not the man who ordered a hit on your father. I'm trying to be someone better." They talked for hours, sitting in the car in the prison parking lot as the sun rose fully and the world came to life around them. Dante told her about his 3 years inside, about the program he had started for financial literacy, about the books he had read and the philosophy he had wrestled with. He told her about his plans for the future, about wanting to mentor young men from his old neighborhood who were at risk of falling into crime, about using his experience and resources to create legitimate opportunities. He talked about therapy he had started, about confronting the violence in his past and taking responsibility for it, without making excuses. Elena told him about the bookstore, about Sophia's work in criminal justice reform, about the grief of losing their father and the slow process of forgiving him for his choices. She told him about the men she had briefly dated and how none of them had measured up to the connection she felt with Dante, even though that connection was built partly on lies. She told him about waiting without consciously deciding to wait, about loving him despite trying not to, about the fear that she was making a terrible mistake even as she made it. "I can't promise you this will work," Elena said finally, as afternoon light slanted through the car windows. "I can't promise I'll be able to separate who you are now from who you were, or that I'll be comfortable with even the legitimate connections you maintain to your old world. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to give us a real chance this time, built on honesty instead of lies. If you're willing to do that too." Dante reached for her hand, interlacing their fingers with the kind of care that suggested he was afraid she might break. "I'm willing," he said. "I'm more than willing, Elena. I want to build something real with you, something that's not based on manipulation or strategy, but on actual love and trust. It won't be easy. There will be complications from my past, people who don't believe I've changed, threats from rivals who see my legitimate business as weakness. But if you're willing to face those complications with me, then I promise I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of that commitment." They sealed the promise with a kiss, tentative at first and then deeper. 3 years of waiting and wanting pouring into the contact. It was not the fairy tale reunion Elena had sometimes imagined, where everything was perfect and uncomplicated. But it was real, messy and difficult and filled with the weight of history, and that reality felt more valuable than any fantasy could have been. The following months were a period of adjustment as Elena and Dante figured out how to build a relationship in the real world, without the barriers of prison or the fiction of false identities between them. Dante moved into an apartment in Manhattan, modest despite his resources, and he started working at the legitimate businesses his organization had built during his incarceration. Elena maintained the bookstore, her independence important to her sense of self, and they dated properly this time, learning each other without the urgency or deception of their first time together. Sophia remained skeptical but supportive, watching Dante carefully for any signs that he was reverting to old patterns. She and Dante had several long, difficult conversations where Sophia asked pointed questions about his past and his plans, testing his sincerity. Dante answered honestly, not shying away from the terrible things he had done, acknowledging that he could never fully atone for the violence he had ordered, but that he was trying to build something better. Sophia eventually concluded that Dante was sincere, though she told Elena privately that she would always be watching, always ready to protect her sister if Dante proved unworthy of her trust. Marco became an unexpected friend to Elena, his loyalty to Dante extending to support for Dante's relationship. Marco and Sophia developed a wary respect for each other, two intensely protective people who recognized similar dedication in one another. Marco had followed Dante out of the criminal world, transitioning his skills into running a legitimate security consulting firm that employed many former Moretti soldiers who were also trying to leave crime behind. It was not perfect. Some men could not make the transition. Some situations required skills and contacts that blurred the line between legal and illegal. But it was better. A genuine attempt at transformation, rather than just rebranding. A year after Dante's release, Elena and Dante took a trip together, their first real vacation, to a small town in upstate New York. They stayed in a bed and breakfast overlooking a lake, spending their days hiking and reading and talking about everything and nothing. One evening, as they sat on the dock watching the sunset, Dante pulled out a small box that made Elena's breath catch. "I don't want to pressure you," Dante said, by holding the box without opening it. "And I'll understand if your answer is not yet or even not ever. But I love you, Elena Torres, and I want to spend my life with you if you'll have me. I'm not the man I was when we met, but I'm also not entirely different. I'm someone in between, someone trying to be better while carrying the weight of who I was. If you can accept that complicated person, if you can see a future with me despite everything, then I would be honored to marry you." Elena took the box, opening it to reveal a simple ring, elegant in its lack of ostentation. She thought about the journey they had both taken, the ways they had hurt and healed each other, the impossibility that had somehow become possible. She thought about her father's letter and his blessing, about Sophia's cautious approval, about the life she had built in the bookstore and the life Dante was building in his legitimate businesses. She thought about second chances and forgiveness, about love that existed in the gray spaces between right and wrong. "Yes," she said, slipping the ring onto her finger. "Yes, I'll marry you, Dante Moretti. Not because everything is perfect or because I've forgotten the past, but because I believe in who you're becoming and because I want to be part of that becoming. We'll figure out the complications together." They married 6 months later in a small ceremony that felt right for who they had become. Sophia stood as Elena's maid of honor, her presence a reminder of how far they had all come. Marco served as Dante's best man, his loyalty to his friend evident in every detail he managed. The guest list was small, a handful of friends from the bookstore, some of Sophia's law school colleagues, and a few of Dante's employees who had become genuine friends during the transition to legitimate business, and Joseph Torres representing Elena's father's family. The ceremony took place at the bookstore after hours, surrounded by the books that had been Elena's sanctuary and salvation. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises that acknowledged their complicated history while committing to a future built on truth and trust. When Dante promised to spend his life trying to be worthy of Elena's love, his voice broke with emotion. When Elena promised to accept Dante fully, both his past and his present, both his darkness and his light, there were no dry eyes in the room. The reception was held at one of Dante's restaurants, a small Italian place in the West Village that served authentic food without pretension. They danced to jazz music, Dante holding Elena close and whispering in her ear about all the days they would have together, all the ordinary moments that would make up their extraordinary life. Sophia danced with Marco, the two of them arguing good-naturedly about criminal justice policy even as they moved in sync to the music. As the night wound down and guests began to leave, Elena stood with Dante in the restaurant's small garden, the city lights visible beyond the walls, the sound of traffic a distant hum. She thought about the letter she had written years ago to an inmate she believed was Daniel Morrison, an accountant wrongly convicted. She thought about how that letter had set in motion a series of events that should have ended in tragedy, but had somehow, improbably, ended here in a garden on her wedding night, married to the man who had both broken her heart and helped her rebuild it stronger. "What are you thinking?" Dante asked, pulling her closer. "I'm thinking about second chapters," Elena said, smiling up at him. "About how stories don't always end where we expect them to, how characters can change and grow and become different versions of themselves. I'm thinking that we're writing our second chapter now, and I'm excited to see where it goes." Dante kissed her, tender and full of promise. "I'll write this chapter with you every day for the rest of our lives," he said. "Every single day, Elena. I'll choose you and choose to be better because of you." They left the restaurant hand in hand, walking toward their future together, two people who had found each other in the darkest places and chosen to walk toward the light. The city stretched out around them, full of possibility and complication, and they stepped into it together, ready to face whatever came next, armed with love and truth and the hard-won knowledge that redemption was not a destination, but a daily practice. A message to you, dear reader. If you've made it this far in Elena and Dante's story, thank you for taking this journey through love, betrayal, transformation, and redemption. This tale explored the complex gray areas between right and wrong, asking difficult questions about whether people can truly change, whether love can exist between those who should be enemies, and what forgiveness really means. Stories like this remind us that humans are never simply one thing. We are all contradictions, all capable of both terrible acts and profound love, often simultaneously. Elena and Dante's relationship was built on lies that became truth, on manipulation that evolved into genuine connection, on violence that gave way to protection. It's messy and imperfect, much like real life and real love. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment resonated most with you? Do you believe in Dante's redemption? Did Elena make the right choice? Share your reflections in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates complex romance, tales of second chances, or narratives that refuse to oversimplify the human experience. Every share helps these stories reach readers who need them. Until our next chapter together, keep believing in the power of transformation and the possibility of love in even the most impossible circumstances. With gratitude and story-filled wishes,